afternoon. I'm Billy Martin. I'm a member of the Botetourt County Board of Supervisors and today's moderator for the new energy infrastructure. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. We have two good speakers, and we're so thankful that they came. Speaking first will be State Delegate Rick Sullivan, that's to my immediate left. First elected in 2014, Delegate Sullivan represents the 48th District, which includes parts of the counties of Arlington and Fairfax. In 2020, Delegate Sullivan patroned the Virginia Clean Economy Act, VCEA, which became law and sets targets for Virginia's electric utilities to reach zero carbon emissions within the next 30 years. Rip graduated magna cum laude from Amherst College and received his law degree from the University of Virginia. And he is a partner in the law firm Bean, Kennedy & Corman, PC in Arlington. Our second panelist at the end of the table is Bill Murray, Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs and Communications at Dominion Energy. He is responsible for federal, state, and local government relations, corporate communications, advertising, public relations, creative services, philanthropy, and community affairs. He is a member of the boards of directors at the Virginia State University and the Virginia Commonwealth University Foundation. Mr. Murray received his bachelor's degree in history from the University of Virginia, his master's degree in public administration from Virginia Tech, and his doctorate in public administration and public policy from Virginia Tech. So let's give a warm Baker welcome to our panel. First, I want to start off, I'll have a question for Delegate Sullivan. Recently, the Governor of Virginia, as part of the 2020 Virginia Energy Plan, has proposed that the Virginia Clean Economy Act, VCEA, has reevaluated based on latest technology availability and cost assessments and reauthorized in 2023 and every 5 years thereafter. Delegate Sullivan, do you envision the General Assembly agreeing to this proposal, number one? And if not, are there changes to the VCEA that you think might be appropriate to make in the future based on changing conditions in technologies or markets?
Thank you, Billy. I promise I will answer your question. And this is, I know, very unusual, but I wonder if I might ask you all to take just a quick moment of silence and think about our friends in Charlottesville and the families who have lost loved ones. Thank you. It is really delightful to be here. I walked in and saw a lot of friends. I love working with local government in Virginia, and I'm really pleased to share the stage with Dr. Murray. I think your job description is longer than Bob Blue's, actually.
Well, much less important.
I met Bill. We were just reminiscing, I think, days after I was elected to the General Assembly, and I've enjoyed working with him over the years. When I first ran for office, I had made clear that one of the things I wanted to work hard on was everything from energy efficiency to renewable energy, all the things having to do with energy. I've sort of become the General Assembly's energy efficiency nerd and renewable energy guy, or at least one of them, and that means I get to spend a lot of time with Bill and his colleagues at Dominion. And it's always been an enjoyable experience, although we haven't always agreed on everything. The Clean Economy Act, I really think was a bit of a legislative miracle, particularly in a General Assembly like Virginia's, and by that I simply mean we have such a compressed session, and trying to get something as big and impactful as the DCEA through a General Assembly in 8 short weeks is really a heavy lift. And it could have died a dozen times, but somehow or another we got it through. And to my way of thinking was an historic piece of legislation which really vaulted Virginia to the front of the pack in terms of its commitment to 100% renewable energy, and it really took us from going in this direction to going in that direction. And so it's now been law for a couple of years. In my view, and I don't know how much time you want me to spend on it, Billy, but it has already shown exactly how impactful it has been and can be and will be going forward. But it nevertheless is still quite controversial, at least in some quarters. The question had to do with the governor's energy plan, and I sat on a panel with the Deputy Secretary of Commerce a couple weeks ago at the Clean Energy Summit, and I think she was a little surprised to hear that I wasn't all that in love with the governor's plan. There are a variety of reasons for that, but apropos of your comment or your question, Billy, one of the things that sticks out in the energy plan to me, which I think which gives me great pause, is the notion that we should, I think the word he used in his plan was reevaluate it in the 2023 session, and then pass some legislation that would require that the plan be reauthorized every 5 years. One of the things about the plan, I think, or the act that is so important is it sent a signal to the world, it sent a signal to business, it sent a signal to government at all levels, the state and the local level, that this was our path, this is where we were headed, and it gave predictability and direction to where we were going to go, and how we planned on getting there. Drop a footnote there, I'll come back to that in just a second, but how we planned on getting there. And if there were a bunch of, I don't know, solar developers in the room or wind developers in the room, I think they would tell you, I take that back, I know they would tell you, that to make the kind of long-term commitments of money, talent, and corporate or governmental time and energy, you have to have predictability about what's going to be there next year, the year after that, and the year after that, and where a particular entity is heading. And if the signal is not, this is where we're going and this is how we get there, but this is what we think we want to do for the next few years, and then we're going to think about it again, maybe change course in a few years, you will have blown a big hole in the potential of the clean economy. So that's the proposal you asked me about, Billy. The answer is I personally will oppose that in the General Assembly. Politics is all about numbers, and I will resist it with everything I've got in my chamber. But I only got 48 votes in my chamber, while I will work hard to twist some arms and change some votes, I'm clear-eyed about the possibility, I'll call it, if not likelihood, that a proposal like that might get through the House. I'll then sprint down the hall to the other end of the Capitol and work really hard with my colleagues on the Democratic side, and anyone on the other side who wants to listen to me, to convince the Senate that they should not agree to that particular part of the governor's energy plan. And like they did last session when there were proposals to repeal the Clean Economy Act outright, I'm going to work with them and block the governor's proposal. So somebody tells me the Clean Economy Act will come up again, but that's my answer to your initial question.
Okay, the next question I'll ask is for Bill Murray. And in the 2022 Virginia Energy Plan, the administration sets the goal of deploying a commercial small modular nuclear reactor in Southwest Virginia within the next 10 years. Question for you. Does Dominion plan to be a part of this conversation, number one? And number two, is it doable? And three, how does this compare and or compete with developing the proposed pump storage facility in this same region?
Let me give brief answers to each of those questions, talk a little more generally about nuclear power and Dominion Energy Virginia's 50-year history as of next month with nuclear power. Yes, we'd like to be involved in the conversation. Yes, it's doable. It's certainly going to be what you might call an all-hands drill in the nuclear business, but it is doable. And then in terms of competing with a pump storage facility, the more and more we think about storage and generation, storage is a distinct part of the business. So without speaking to one or the other, they just play different roles in the system. I think there's sometimes a view in energy that because you like one thing, it means all other things are bad. And that's kind of, how many of y'all like Lord of the Rings in here? Like that show? Raise your hands. There's a little bit of a tendency to the one ring that rules them all in energy policy. And for reasons I'm going to explain in a minute, we've never really kind of believed in the put all your eggs in one basket approach in energy policy. And in that regard, let me tell you about Dominion's entree into the nuclear business in 1972 with Surrey Power Station. So Surrey 1 opened in, and you know, the way we name our nuclear stations is pretty straightforward. Surrey's in Surrey, North Anna, on the northern part of Lake Anna in Louisa County. You know, we're pretty straightforward. But in any event, at that time, oil-fired generation, now coal oil-fired generation, was very common, had been very affordable for a long time, and all the different sort of forecasts showed that it was going to be affordable forever. And one thing you know about any forecast is you know it's wrong when you make it. You know, you hope it's more accurate than not, but you know it's wrong. So we did a little bit of criticism that we're building 2 nuclear units, and at the same time we were working on planning for 2 more nuclear units that became North Anna 1 and 2, because why weren't we just doing the cheaper oil? So in any event, Surrey 1 opened in December of 1972. Surrey 2 followed very shortly thereafter, 1 unit, in the spring of 1973. And again, criticism, Dominion just built 2 expensive new nuclear units. Oil would have been so much cheaper. Well, that fall, on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, the combined armies of the Arab states caught Israel totally by surprise. Almost had Israel lose its first war. And President Nixon, whatever your views are of the Nixon administration, stripped our frontline divisions in Germany's bear to resupply the Israelis. Soviets did the same thing for their allies. And suddenly what looked like a certain Israeli defeat became something that looked like a victory towards the end. Now, after the conclusion of the Yom Kippur War, where both the Soviets and the Americans came really, you know, maybe a little closer to the brink they wanted, called a halt to the war, the OPEC states implemented what Daniel Yergin calls the first oil shock, the Arab oil embargo. My father in those days was commuting from Newport News to Richmond, and he used to have to beg for gas because what we did to manage that, first of all, prices quadrupled. But in a way, the price was, while very notable, price increase, I'm in no way making light of that. That was almost beside the point because availability became the issue. And Governor Bill Godwin at the time implemented to manage through the crisis. This was Godwin too, I guess, at this point. So by now we're jumping into 1974. Odd even license plates. And if y'all are young, you're going to think I'm telling you a fanciful story. You just call your parents and they'll tell you I'm right. If you had your license plate end with an odd number, then you could buy, I'm probably got this reversed, so this is just random chances, right? Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, and if you had an even number, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and so on, so you can only buy gas every other day, and that was the way we rationed gas. Suddenly having nearly 2,000 megawatts, and a megawatt's about enough energy for 250 homes, So sorry if you were going to round, which they don't really do in the nuclear business. I'm the liberal arts major describing a highly technical field. So sorry is all about enough energy for about 500,000 homes. So figure about 1.5 million people. Suddenly having that, not dependent on oil, round-the-clock generation where you knew your fuel costs from day to day, look pretty smart. So it is baked in our corporate DNA that nuclear is part of a smart energy solution. Also, here's a trick question. How much carbon does a nuclear station emit? 0. My thumbnail here, my fingers are kind of big, but my thumbnail here has about, if that were uranium, would have enough energy to equal a rail car full of oil, or natural gas for that matter. Now, small modular reactors. Yes, it is true. There are no commercially deployed small modular reactors. We have a bunch of what are equivalent to small modular reactors here in this, here off in the waters of the Commonwealth. I'll give you all a hint. Who operates those? United States Navy. Nuclear submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers. At one time, we had nuclear-powered cruisers. Also, they were a casualty of the post-Cold War defense cutbacks. In fact, the bell of the cruiser USS Virginia is right over there at the state capitol if you want to look at it. So we're all in on nuclear, always have been all in on nuclear. In addition to the 4 units we operate in Virginia, we've got 2 in the state of Connecticut, the largest generation station in New England, Millstone Power Station. We've got 1 unit in our South Carolina utility, VC Summer. So we think nuclear power has made a lot of sense, and we're fixing to throw a big birthday party for our nuclear business here coming up shortly. 50 years is not anything to sneeze at. So definitely we want to be part of the conversation. We think we've got a pretty proven record to bring to the table.
Billy, the only thing I want to add to what Bill said was back to the energy plan and the Clean Economy Act. There is a suggestion in the governor's energy plan that BCEA's shining a spotlight and focus on wind, solar, storage, energy efficiency is exclusive, excludes all other forms of energy. And that is actually just not correct. The bill specifically talks about, actually I think talks about nuclear, talks about hydrogen, and has always contemplated that as the years unfold and technology evolves, that we would want to keep an eye on that, and the legislature might indeed need to go back and take a look at that, at the plan. But one thing Bill did say, I think he'd agree with this, is that any commercial use of a small modular reactor, the plan itself, the governor's plan itself says it's at least 10 years away. And so the notion of sort of shifting from where we're headed and stopping that and moving towards and waiting, for you, if you will, for the moonshot, which the governor calls the modular reactor plan, is a moonshot, waiting for that to come into play, strikes me as unwise. We've got a path, let's keep on our path. The modular reactor works out, great, we add it to the mix. Some of the future General Assembly will have to take a look at that. I guess what I'm saying is the notion that the Clean Economy Act is cast in stone, unchangeable, and excludes nuclear or hydrogen, or for good, if Don Beyer was standing here, he'd start talking about fusion. We're closer to fusion than we have ever been. No one knows quite what that means, but there's a sense that it's suddenly might be in the less distant future than we thought. It's sort of the holy grail of clean energy. I'm not going to stand in the way. I'm not going to try to stand in the way of the moonshot, unless and until the governor comes in and says he wants to derail everything we're doing now and wait for the moonshot.
Just 2 quick things. What we're saying in our latest an integrated resource plan is a utility planning document. It's a snapshot of time. Because we run very large Dominion Energy in Virginia and relatively small Dominion Energy in North Carolina, that's the utility that serves the Outer Banks. We run them as one generation portfolio, so we effectively manage them as one company, even though they're 2 distinct legal entities. We end up filing an integrated resource plan, whether it's in Virginia or North Carolina, more or less every year. And what we're saying is early 2030s. And we'll keep refining that. This is actually the first year we showed a nuclear plant or a small modular reactor rather, in our integrated resource plan in the planning scenarios. We'll have more to say on that. Our next Virginia full-blown update is due in the spring of 2023, so we'll have more to say then. And then just a note on the Clean Economy Act, at least the way I read it as a non-lawyer, there is nothing, when 2045 comes, there is nothing prohibiting operation of either a conventional nuclear plant or an SMR, because both of them, as I mentioned, both are, in addition to their many other merits, both are carbon-free.
Okay, thank both of you for answering those. I have one more question that I would like to ask, and I would like for both panelists to answer this. Given the significant federal infusion of capital investment under the Inflation Reduction Act, what opportunities do you see for Virginia to develop industries, supply chains, jobs, and related investment in new energy technologies?
So offshore wind, let's just talk about the offshore wind. What I would say is the supply chain development for offshore wind in Virginia was well underway at the time the relevant federal legislation passed. Certainly that legislation has got a production tax credit for offshore wind, which is certainly material, and that's a notable development. Last end of 2021, Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy announced they were going to put the first blade facility for offshore wind in the United States at Portsmouth Marine Terminal at the Port of Virginia. At Dominion Energy at the holding company level, so not at the Virginia utility level, but at the parent level. We kind of did our own contribution to kickstart the offshore wind supply chain with our investment in an offshore wind an offshore wind installation vessel under construction now in Brownsville, Texas. It has the name Charybdis, so Charybdis rock in a hard place. I can't say it's Charybdis, and those of y'all are Greek scholars can properly pronounce the other counterparty there. I've just got this mental tick and I can't pronounce it, but I can pronounce Charybdis. It's not just to supply our project off the coast of Virginia with the entire East Coast supply chain. The opportunity that we have there, and if there's one lesson in energy policy from the last 40 or 50 years, well, let's say 50, because I just told you about the Arab oil embargo of 1973, so that's coming up on 50 years. Energy independence is a good thing in all respects, not just in commodities, but in generation and in supply chain. And there was, and I'm not trying to unwind decades of globalization, but there was a moment when I think we made maybe an error of enthusiasm, as Yankee manager Casey Stengel would say, when we talked about the world being flat. And a global supply chain is great, but some degree of self-sufficiency is also important, because there is a fine line between a global supply chain and a terrible vulnerability at moments of supply chain shortages. U.S. has been the workshop of the world for more than 100 years. That's been to the benefit of not just the U.S., but to the world generally. And an important part of energy independence is not just the commodity, and we're blessed with a lot of energy commodities and a lot of energy resources, from natural gas to wind to abundant solar energy, but and not just the infrastructure, but also the supply chain. And that's one that maybe we had not been as strong on as a nation for the last year or so, whether it is the offshore wind cluster that's developing in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and other places in the state, or the potential for further development of the nuclear supply chain, both in Hampton Roads and in the Lynchburg area. I think an energy supply chain, everything the state can do in that regard is both beneficial for Virginia, it's beneficial for the United States, and it's beneficial for the whole free world.
I am enormously optimistic and enthusiastic about what the legislation that has passed in Washington recently has in store for Virginia, all of Virginia. I think the opportunities are almost limitless, and frankly, I think as people read the darn thing, they keep finding new opportunities. Bill's exactly right, certainly on wind, and that's already underway. I'll go to the other end of the spectrum, some very small stuff, but might be interested of interest to this group. I was just on the phone with someone at the Department of Energy the other day, and we were talking about local clean energy plans. A lot of jurisdictions have them, some don't. Some have the ability to put them together, some don't. There is money in the Infrastructure Act for localities. It's coming through the state, for the state to use and work with localities to create local clean energy plans. I'm trying to marry up George Mason, which is in Fairfax County, one of my jurisdictions. There's a group there that wants to and has been actively trying to work with jurisdictions, localities all across Virginia, particularly those that may not have the expertise or the person power to do it on their own, to help localities come up with clean energy plans. So I'm trying to marry up the state money with George Mason and with localities so that we can have many more localities than already are all around Virginia working on their own clean energy plans going off into the future. But as I said, the opportunities I think are boundless. I just came from a meeting of the House Appropriations and Finance Committees, and we got a presentation from Virginia Economic Development. And they, of course, are always constantly 24/7, 365 days a year trying to entice companies to come into Virginia. I look longingly at what Governor Pritzker just passed in Illinois, a bill trying to get car manufacturers to come and start building all those electric cars in his state, to get energy storage battery manufacturers and researchers to come to his state and create jobs and industries there. We should be doing the same thing. The opportunity is there. We've swung and missed on a couple of recent opportunities, but we ought to have electric vehicles made here right here in Virginia. We ought to have electric charging stations made right here in Virginia. And there's opportunities under these new pieces of legislation if we can get the energy and the enthusiasm and the political will to have a lot of that done right here in Virginia, in places that have been maybe losing jobs because of the energy transition. That's where we ought to be focusing on putting in new clean energy and electrification. The electric vehicles are coming. Just ask GM, Ford, and every other car dealership, car manufacturer you see advertising every night on television. They have made that decision. Virginia needs to get on board and be a part of that. And last year's, most of you probably know, we passed the Clean Car Standards bill to do exactly that, which is to try to get Virginia to be a leader there. I like to think government can be an accelerator. Market's moving, but we can make it move faster. We can accelerate it here in Virginia, bring jobs, and use, to answer your question, Bill, this federal money, which is there for the taking, to help Virginia take part in lots and lots of new opportunities, all tied to the new clean energy economy.
Good, thank you. I have one question, and it's just for these small nuclear reactors that's going to be going to Southwest Virginia, how large are they and how much room do they take?
So I'm going to, with the evolving technology, these are all sort of approximate numbers that are out there. And while the governor's plan specifically mentions Southwest Virginia, we're looking at a number of sites because traditional nuclear reactors like North Anna or Surrey, you might in a period of decades, you might do one or two. In our case, we've done 2 sites in 50 years. The idea of small modular reactors, you can distribute them more broadly across your system at multiple sites. Generally, the range, I'll take the midpoint of the range, around 300 megawatts. A more traditional unit might be around 1,000, or one that was built, if you were to build a large-scale plant today, like if we were to proceed with development in North Anna 3, it would be like in the range of 1,500 megawatt units. So around 300 megawatts, the site would be several hundred acres. From a safety standpoint, right now when we think about sort of the emergency planning zone for a large unit, you think about a pretty significant geographic area. Depending on where it's sited, it might involve multiple localities. One of the selling points for a small modular reactor is you're looking at, and I hasten to add, the nuclear industry has had a safety record in the United States that is second to none. I hate to add that, but you're looking at a emergency planning zone that is largely the fence line of the plant, soon to be by, and that is a very market development. But yeah, a rough approximation, if you think about the type of technologies are different. This is only an analogy. I hate to add for my engineer colleagues, but it is equivalent to what you would see in a nuclear carrier.
Okay, we'll take questions now. We have till 4 o'clock, that's 45 minutes, so we're in good shape. I see a hand up in the back, way back in the back already.
John Magruder, Essex County, very rural, agriculture, forestry-based county. You're talking about 10-year programs. Why don't we talk about biomass? We have the infrastructure in place. It can start today. We have the workforce there. We don't need to add a lot to it. There's agriculture commodities from crops that can be used, phragmites in our marshes that needs to go. Forestry, it's a residue. Our state forester this morning said we're growing more wood than we're harvesting, and they leave a lot of the brush and debris on the ground that could be utilized for biomass fuel. Why aren't we talking about an answer that has been in our back pocket for decades, and nobody talks about it because it's not new, it's not glamorous, it's not fancy like small nuclear reactors, solar, wind, or anything like that. Cavemen have been heating houses since thousands of years ago, and here's the technology that's there, already usable, and nobody's talking about it. Why is that? Thank you.
This is Bill from Dominion's perspective. We, okay, the years are starting to run together. So as while I was working at Dominion, so now it's been in the last 15 years, about 10 years ago, and please, I'm now reaching the age, hold me to plus or minus a couple years there, we converted 3 early 90s era coal plants, Alta Vista, Southampton, and Hopewell, from coal to biomass. Alta Vista, Southampton, and Hopewell, each around 50 megawatts. Again, a megawatt, enough energy to serve 250 homes, so you can sort of do the math from there. So while small for a coal plant, pretty large for a biomass plant, our Virginia City Hybrid Energy Center can co-fire with up to 20% biomass. And that, you know, in looking at the design parameters for the plant, that pretty well matched the available wood basket for the area. Now, I'm not an expert on energy tax policy, so some of what you will see in terms of economics of energy resources, you've got a variety of components that fuel costs being one, capital costs being another, but also tax policy. And I'm not familiar with the IRA's tax treatment of biomass. I'm familiar with its treatment of offshore wind because that's my current focus. But in Dominion's case, we've got 4 notable facilities that either are entirely powered by biomass, or in the case of Virginia City, 600 megawatt, here again I'm rounding, 600 megawatt facility where up to 20% can come fire with biomass. So altogether, that's about 270 megawatts of biomass capacity.
The first thing I want to say in response to your question, sir, is you know, you're suggesting that no one's talking about it. There are plenty of people talking about it now. I think what you mean is no one's doing anything about it, and that's a little different. But biomass is mentioned in the Clean Economy Act. There is candidly some difference of opinion having to do with the greenhouse gas emissions related to biomass. But that's something we also need to talk about in the context of other emerging technologies like combined heat and power, which are incredibly highly efficient ways of generating electricity and heat. Many times can and ought to be fired with biomass. So I think I end up where I started, which is there's nothing off the table as far as the Clean Economy Act is concerned. And Bill's made the point that we ought to be looking at lots and lots of different options. But people are talking about it. The question is, can it be done economically? Can it be done in an environmentally sound way that does get us where we want to get to, which is zero carbon by 2045.
Okay, thank you. Take another question. Yes, sir.
More safe than anything. I'm on a board at a clinic where I live. I'm Danny Man, Scott County. President of that board, and we're putting in a solar farm at the speed. We couldn't do it without government assistance. And so the clinic, their power bill runs $1,800 a month. So we're gonna save $1,000 a month. Put that in. The cost is $259,000. Okay? And we're putting in, we got the grant for $202,000, so we're putting in $57,000 to get this done. But $259,000 will save $1,000 a month. We could not do it without government assistance. That's totally not worth it. I mean, there's no way that you can do that. Now, I attended the co-conference. I worked for the state 20 years, co-industry for 44 years. I went to a co-conference in Tennessee in 2016. Guy there spoke, and he had the numbers about coal. I'm pro-coal, all the above. And he said, our coal would generate power from 6 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour. He said, oil and gas is 14 to 15 cents. Nuclear is 19. He said, the green energy, you can't calculate the cost. It's so government subsidized. Now, the conference, a couple years before that, I went to it, and there was people there from China and India, and they want our energy. They have on the drawing board to build 1,140 new coal-fired plants. Now, they were there, they want our energy. And this guy, when he said, we're going to give them or sell them our energy, they're going to go green, but you can't even calculate the cost of it. So this clinic, and they're built, I was there Friday, they're got the panels in, and we'll have that running. But folks, all the above, and we keep shutting these power plants down. The Northeast, 40 million people, if another polar vortex happens, they're in trouble. Natural gas cannot keep up. It cannot. Now, the lady spoke there at that conference. We had a polar vortex happen in 2015, and she said, had it not been for the coal-fired plants then, in 2015, half the United States would have been black. We maxed out everything we had and 50 bucks. She said the coal-fired plants we had, we maxed them out and was able to keep the blackout from happening. She said, now, this is 2016. If it happens again, half the country comes to black. So we cannot, if we keep doing this, I'm telling you, Elon Musk, he's the electric car guy, he says we can't do it. And so we keep pushing this. And so, I mean, I bought a battery for my bicycle, and it was $500 for the battery for it. And so, folks, I'm telling you, if we don't count all the above as an energy source, we are in trouble. I don't have to work. So anyway, think about it. I'm pro-coal. When that's plant emergency you talk about, they're using biomass, they're using refuge stuff, the old prep plants and all this, and they're burning it, they're doing a lot of stuff there with that. I'm about 10 miles of coal plant in Scott County from Wise County. But I'm telling you, we're in trouble here. If we try to go all electric, we're in trouble. Thank you.
I'll just mention where we have so Virginia City, I mentioned the biomass, and you mentioned sort of it burns scrap coal, it also burns lime coal as well. And then the other two coal plants that we have, one we co-own with the electric cooperatives, Clover, which is in Halifax County, and then going back to many, many years ago when we were a utility in West Virginia, an electric utility, we just sold a gas utility, we have Mount Storm, which is over the border in West Virginia, but it serves Virginia customers, and it's owned by Virginia customers.
That's what we're thinking about. Look at the county, how we done in coal mines. 1,800 feet straight down. The Botetourt is saying it's the best coal in the world. Met coal is the best in the world. And you look in the roof, and you see fossils. You see ferns and sticks. How did you get there? 1,800 feet down, it's 400 feet above sea level. So you look at all this 1,800 feet earth above you, did we cause that? So, anyway, I didn't say all that. You go down here, 1,800 feet, and you see plank lines. How'd you get there?
Let me give a shout out to Bob Lamont while I seize the microphone here. Virginia Tech's been a leader in carbon capture and storage research. Dr. Karmas, from my observation, somewhat falsely claims to be retired. For a retired person, he wears more ties than I do, so just draw your own conclusions from that. One of the, in thinking about policy issues and energy policy in the next few decades, whether it's for gas, coal, or both, or for that matter, you're going to certainly continue to see research efforts around carbon capture and storage, and that is something I'm pleased to say Virginia Tech is a leader on. And that's among, Doug Sullivan alluded to, and Supervisor Martin both alluded to some of the pending technology issues, whether it's small modular reactors, hydrogen, fusion, and I would add to that carbon capture and storage.
Oh, yes, yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Billy. April Motts, Montgomery County, go ahead. Wanted to ask specifically of you, sir, if you might have any understanding of the governor's desire to use Southwest Virginia for the small modular reactor first, which is tested in clear at Southwest Virginia. And I say that as somebody that's right on, I guess, the northern edge of Southwest Virginia, but also lives in Kingsville, Tennessee. So I'm sensitive to the issues of Southwest Virginia, and also it's sometimes almost a sacrifice zone in Virginia, or seen that way. And so I'm sensitive to why would that be so particularly where he's interested in nuclear first? And then also, would Dominion be able to have a role in that part of Virginia that's generally AEP country?
So I'll say a couple of things. One, I'll reiterate something I said earlier. We're looking all over our service territory for where it makes sense to set up a small modular reactor. And just our existing two, just stay where they are. One is in Eastern Virginia, Surrey County. One's in Central Virginia, Louisa County, at North Anna. As far as having power plants that are not located in your service territory, there is precedent for that. We own the Virginia Center Howard Energy Center, which is certainly in AEP territory. In fact, it's right down the road from AEP's now closed Carbo power station. And then mentioned earlier, now this goes back to when at one time we had utility service territory in West Virginia. Virginia customers own the Mount Storm Power Station in West Virginia. But I will say the whole premise of small modular reactors is that they would be, rather than the traditional approach to nuclear where you just have one or two for your whole utility and they are where they are, is that they're more distributed across your territory. So while the governor's plan specifically calls out Southwest Virginia, just from a planning standpoint, I can tell you we're looking all over our territory, including, it's not great secret, one of the places you would always look is places you already have a nuclear facility, or where you've had other types of energy facilities.
I thought where you might be heading, what did you call Southwest, a target area?
It's sacrifice.
Sacrifice area, yeah.
And I'd say that, people, Bill made the point, people do tend to catastrophize things that they know nothing about. And then also, there isn't infrastructure there necessary, or even people there maybe that would be able to specialize in that kind of work.
Well, it's not my job to defend the governor, but I think if he were here, he would tell you that actually Virginia has some of the nation's best leading companies in the area, a lot of expertise, and I actually believe they're located down in Lynchburg, excuse me. So there's talent. There's talent for it. I thought where you might be heading, and frankly, I thought this sort of Essex might have been heading, was this notion of solar denuding the Commonwealth. And it's all going into localities in central and southwest Virginia, and we're going to lose our forests and our farms. One of the bills I was particularly proud to carry last year was a bill that tried to free up more urban and suburban localities to be able to use properties that they own, whether we're talking about landfills or just the roofs of their parking garages, for more solar, so that the entire state is actually participating. We're not just looking to put big, I don't call them solar farms anymore, solar facilities just in rural parts of Virginia, but urban and suburban parts of Virginia need to do their part, whether we're talking about solar or even carbon capture, and certainly storage. Because we do need to be looking all around the state to make sure everyone's carrying their part of the load, part of the plan.
Take another question. Back in the back.
Yes, sir.
Hello, I'm Dexter Jones. I'm from Supervisor from Amelia, and I'm a farmer. I've listened to what you said in here. I'm sort of glad you just clarified something about solar farm to solar complexes, because galvanized homes sort of be hard to eat if you keep calling them a farm. That being said, I got several things. With a lot of the government policies and everything, is they put the cart before the horse. When Henry Ford come out with the Model T and started mass producing it, the masses didn't go out here and shoot all the horses. It took a long time for the car to get accepted into the community. We have an electric vehicle shoved down our throats because it's green. If the government wasn't throwing so much of our tax money at these solar companies and all, we wouldn't be hearing as much about it and all. Because the truth be known, we're paying for this and we're going to get billed on again on it. I am an advocate for protecting farmland because I got to eat. I grew up on a farm. I know what it is to struggle 10 to 12 hours a day, right? Now, my combine is sitting in the field waiting on me to get back on it. Putting soybeans, trying to get these soybeans in. But green energy and solar is not the answer. Because if we keep taking all our farmland away, we're not going to notice it 5 years from now. We're not going to notice it 10 years from now. Our grandchildren might notice it when they go to Food Line or Kroger's and all. Where's the food at? Well, we was dependent on another country to give us our food, and guess what? They're mad at us. They're not sending us no food. So we're going to starve. Y'all say nuclear power plants is 10 years away. I hope it does come. But if it does, what are we going to do with all these here solar installations that will be obsolete by then? And you can say they won't be obsolete, they'll be upgraded through technology. Most of us working people know how that works. And that farmland that all these professors who go out on a farm at these major universities or whatever and saying, well, we can put it back into farmland. A farmer knows better. He lives on that land, his life is that land, and he knows what Mother Nature does to the land. If you desecrate that land and hurt it, it don't come back. Solar companies that I talk to that has been presenting them up there where we live, they say 35 years from now we're going to turn it back into what it is. Well, actually it's a desert. That's what it's going to be because you burnt that soul. Chesapeake Bay Act, we heard nothing about how when they're building these solar facilities, how are they protecting the runoff and everything that happens, and you can't stop it. You put a retention pond in there, you still have problems with it while you build it. That's going to sit back to Chesapeake Bay cleanup years. They finally get it to where it's really helping something. I mean, I'm a good steward of my land. I apply every conservation practice I can because I know it helps that soil. And that's just the way we grew up, take care of this stuff. But if the government wasn't throwing this money into it, we wouldn't be having a whole lot of conversation on solar. We need to look at more than just solar. We look at the others that won't hurt our food supply. That's what I'm worried about 30 years, 40 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. But I was referring to the whole debate about siting. That was another bill we passed last year, where we put together a work group to talk about how can we work together to site solar plants, solar facilities, to make sure we are being good stewards of it. There's an interesting balance between what a landowner wants to do with his or her land and their right to control what they do with his or her land, and environmental concerns having to do with preserving forests and farms. There's just no question about it. And so we do need to be thoughtful about how we go about citing these things. I'm not sure I agree with you that absent the government, we wouldn't be having solar. By, I think, all accounts, it is true that the cost of solar as a means of producing energy has dropped dramatically and is continuing to drop dramatically, and is about the cheapest way, short of just sheer old energy efficiency, to produce power that's going these days. It's certainly cheaper than now natural gas. It's certainly cheaper than nuclear as we know it now. So this isn't all going to happen immediately. And as we do it, we do need to be thoughtful about it and take into account the kinds of concerns you were just raising. I don't know about returning something to agriculture. I do know, I've seen it, that there are ways to continue to grow, to use land that has a solar array on it for agricultural purposes. Might be different agricultural purposes than we used for before, but there are ways to do it. I'm not a farmer and would never claim to know anything about actual farming. But I know those conversations are going on, and those methods are being discussed. Can we do both rather than just one? And we need to think outside the box on all these issues. And I think that's what this transition is all about: is being creative, being bold. You know, there was another quote attributed to Henry Ford, which was, "If I built what my customers wanted, I would have just built faster horses." You know, we are living through the kind of time that the kind of transition that the car created. There's a whole new world. You're right. The horse didn't go away, but a lot of blacksmiths lost their jobs and had to find new ones. And I think it's our responsibility to help today's blacksmiths find new work, train them to work in the, whatever it is, the solar industry or the nuclear industry, whatever it might be. We're living through that kind of transition before Edison commercialized the light bulb, right? The candle business got a lot worse after we all started flipping on our electric lights. It's hard to see it when you're in it, but we are in that. I believe we are in that kind of transition, and our children and grandchildren are going to live in a dramatically different world than we do now. And I'm not telling you that I'm trying to do anything that's going to happen in the next year. We cannot stop using fossil fuels next Thursday. We're not ready to do that. But what the Clean Economy Act is all about is trying to marshal Virginia's resources, its talent, and its political will to help us get to that next generation of energy production, because it's coming, whether we like it or not.
I just add a couple of quick things on solar. One, last year's legislature, in addition to the measure that Doug Sullivan alluded to, it also directed a study of prime farmland. I'll give a shout out to several Dominion folks in the room, to our colleague Ed Bain, who's the president of Dominion Energy Virginia, grew up on a tobacco farm in Lunenburg County. And what the study is to identify prime farmland. So frankly, that's something we can avoid in looking at solar siting. In solar energy siting, you're interested in the topography of the land, specifically how flat it is. You're not particularly concerned with the soil characteristics. So there is a land use best fit to achieve with solar energy. The other thing I'll add, this has been Dominion's policy for more than 100 years, so I'm not saying anything new. We support local land use decision making, so we abide by the local land use decision of the given local government. So we're not interested in going anywhere that any of our projects are not welcome. And finally, while the reference was made to solar in Southwest Virginia on a small scale, it's worth noting solar energy, like all energy projects, has economies of scale. So the economics of a very small solar project are different from the economics of a larger project. The final thing I'll note, there was a question about the nuclear workforce earlier. I was negligent in not saying the best source of the nuclear workforce to come out of us is a form of question. Where is the best source of the nuclear workforce in the United States? I'll give you a hint because I alluded to it earlier.
U.S. Navy.
United States Navy, which fortunately we've got a good running start on here in the case of Virginia, and I might add, in the case of our nuclear station in Connecticut, we also get the Navy base in New London. It's 20 minutes away, so we benefited from being in two of the larger. And I might add, the Navy doesn't just recruit from coastal areas. I was just in Iowa for the weekend. There used to be a saying there are more admirals from Iowa than any other state. I think it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but there are Navy veterans in all 50 states.
All right, yeah, this gentleman on the left, my left.
Mike Hankins, Lindbergh County. I support all types of energy from nuclear down to buffalo chips. So, use it. But what I would like to know is when is the government going to stop their support, the financial support using taxpayer dollars of some of these green energy companies? It really doesn't tell us how well they're doing. And I'd like to know who's going to sink and who's going to swim. And we need a line in the sand on when the cutoff date.
Well, I'm not sure exactly how I can answer that question. I will tell you, I don't know if there are any solar developers in the room, but 3 years ago, there were not a lot of solar developers active in Virginia. Today, there are a lot of solar developers active in Virginia. Virginia hasn't given them any money to come here. Virginia isn't subsidizing any of these companies. Virginia took steps to create a better business environment for them. Again, I'm not taking shots at the governor's moonshot, but he makes very clear in his plan that he wants to have the General Assembly allocate dollars to taxpayer dollars to help in the moonshot, to help finance that moonshot. So it is not uncommon, I guess, for the government, in this case, this particular governor, to want to use tax dollars to help accelerate an industry. But there's no Virginia. Bill, correct me if I get this wrong. There's no none of your Virginia tax dollars are subsidizing solar or wind. The feds have some tax credits, but that's different than dollars out the door.
We got 202,000 federal grant to do that solar system.
Yeah. Well, I think that Bill's point.
Tax dollars, 202,000.
Well,
We couldn't do it.
Well, it was a federal money, that's what the state.
Tax dollars.
I hear you. I think some of this was Bill's point, having to do with economies of scale, and I'm not sure how big your solar array is for. Did you say it was a church?
No, it's clinic. Yeah.
Clinic, I'm sorry.
Yeah, 75, 35
Yeah.
patients.
Yeah.
It's pretty big.
Yeah. Well, we're also, I know there are plans ongoing and plans afoot to try to help localities with solar panels on their schools. We're all painfully aware of what's going on and how we need to do better in terms of school construction around Virginia. And as you point out, having a solar array on your roof or nearby can cut a school system's energy costs dramatically. There's a school in my district that is a net zero school. It actually gives off more energy, puts it into the grid than it consumes. And my locality was able to do that. And if we could do more of those things, it drops the locality's energy bills down dramatically. Same thing. Dominion and I work together on a plan for localities to do that same thing, to put power onto the grid and reduce a locality's energy bill. So that we may be spending some money here, but saving some money, helping people save money in the long term on their energy bills.
Let me just add one thing. I may have not been especially clear in some previous answers. We're for all the above. We have 4 nuclear units in Virginia, which I mentioned. They're consistently 30 to 35% of our power in any given year, and that's been true for a half century. We've got the cleanest coal plant in the United States in Wise County, the Duke City Hybrid Energy Center. We have three of the largest, most efficient natural gas plants in the United States, Warren, Brunswick, and Greensville. We call them the Three Sisters. Almost triplet units. Each successive one's a little more efficient than its older sister, but all three are the most efficient in the United States. I mentioned the 4 biomass-capable facilities. Solar's been mentioned here at length. I mentioned our offshore wind project. We've always been a believer in all of the above because that we feel like a smart way to run a utility. Doug Sullivan said an important word, which we've not talked about yet here, which is the grid. So power generation, whenever there's a conference like this, right, because it's the most interesting and sometimes the most controversial, power generation gets talked about probably 95% of the time. It's 1/3 of the business. The way an electric utility works, you generate power, you transmit it over long distances, and then you distribute it to homes and businesses. And I would be negligent if I didn't mention one of the most important things we're doing is the local government of the utility business. And that is to part closest to the customer, and that is strengthening the grid in every possible way. Whether it's more underground neighborhood distribution lines, whether it's greater cybersecurity measures, whether it's greater security around our substations, both physical and cyber. We're doing everything we can to reach what's every utility's goal, and that is zero power outages. We're not there. It may seem like an unattainable North Star, but we are never satisfied until 100% of the lights are on. Nice thing about working at an electric utility, you got one job. You look up to the overhead lights, you know if you're doing it or not. And the last sound you want to hear is the sound of the backup generator.
Okay, we have another gentleman right over here has a question.
Mike Hatfield, I'm the county administrator in Wise County in far southwest Virginia where the Beach power plant is located. We have no Virginia power in our area. We're Kentucky Utilities and AEP, but they still provide power to Northern Virginia to that plant. We have been an energy leader in the coal business for the last 100 years. And our goal is to remain an energy leader in the state of Virginia and in the country for the next 100 years or more. And in doing that, we believe in all of the above that's been talked about. We think there's still room for coal. We think there's room for natural gas. We think there's room for solar. There's wind. And there's roofing. And we would like to have all of those located within the boundaries of our county. And looking at it, because we were a leader in coal, we have hundreds of thousands of acres that are previously mined lands. And in having those, they are ideal for the wind, for the solar, and for the nuclear, because they're not real good for much else, except for maybe, some of them can be developed in a house. We don't have the industry there within that house. And because of the number of acres, about 60% of our county is owned by coal companies. So that's a large area, but we've got 450 square miles. Doing that, you can put these things and you don't have the NIMBYism that you have in a lot of other areas. People aren't going to say, not in my backyard. They've had a coal mine in their backyard. They don't have a solar farm in their backyard. Those things are all things that we believe in and want to have happen in Southwest. One of the other things is on the small modular reactors. We've been working towards having a small modular reactor for 2 years. They're not something that's new that came out. I was at the governor's announcement, which was he wants to put on site. I told him we've been talking to Dominion and talking to other people for over 2 years now in Wise County. So it's not something that's new that's coming out that we haven't researched but also studied. The last thing I would say is when you're looking for talented workers and hard workers and dedicated workers, you're not going to beat the mining industry. they have to be very talented to do what they've done over the last 100 years, provide the amount of energy for the state that they have. And they are easily trainable in doing these other things that need to be done for the different types of things that are there. The last thing I would say is by the end of December, we will have the very first solar farm on previously mined land in the United States.
Is that Red Onion?
No, this is, it's a private, it's for a data center, it's a 3 megawatt, but it's on previously mined land. So very happy to have that in our area.
I'll give a shout out to the Nature Conservancy. We entered into a partnership with them. They're also with other solar developers for exactly that, solar abandoned land. And sir, thank you for being at Wise County for being such a great host. And I also want to thank Surrey and Louisa County for hosting our nuclear facilities. I mentioned previously Halifax County and Wise County in the case of our coal facilities in Virginia. In the case of our oil units, which are in the process of retiring, but York County and Prince William County have been great those over the years. I mentioned Warren, Brunswick, and Greensville. We've also got gas facilities in Chesterfield County, in Buckingham County, our Bear Garden facility. Chesterfield County facility is called Chesterfield Power Station, so it's pretty straightforward there. Also at the long-standing coal site as well. I want to thank all of our host communities, Alta Vista, Southampton, and Hopewell. In the case of biomass, as previously mentioned, numerous localities which are hosted our solar facilities. We don't ever want to go somewhere we're not welcome. We'd like to be a good neighbor. Anytime we fall short of that, please let anybody in Dominion leadership know that, because we've had great relationships with our host communities in the company's history and look forward to many more years, many more forms of energy. And I want to thank all of the localities we work with in our service territory.
My geography of that part of the world is not what it should be, but I was at the mine you were describing, sir. I asked you about Red Onion. I know it's also called the Highland Project. It's getting ready to come online as well as the power on 12,000 homes or something on formerly mined land. I think that's the kind of thing that we need lots more of. I talk to Terry Kilgore about this all the time. I do think that is the future. And one last thing, I know we're getting short. Google, there was a great article The Guardian did of all outlets a month or so ago about the jobs that are available because of the talented workforce down there. And they were talking about a company that used to manufacture things for mining. Now they've pivoted to manufacturing things for battery cases that are used both in solar installations and in battery installations. So the transition is happening. It needs to happen everywhere. And Southwest Virginia, which has always been part of the engine of American and Virginian manufacturing, needs to be a big part of the process. We need to.
We have about 5 minutes left. I saw someone's hand up here a little bit. Gentleman back here, okay?
Yeah, Cannon Watson, Prince Edward County, more of a national thing, but we're the only country that reprocess the nuclear waste. Seems absurd. Any political will at all to change that?
That is a Carter administration executive order, and as I am certainly no expert on nuclear nonproliferation, but my recollection is that was the concern. That's certainly, that you do reprocessing in France. That has certainly been a conversation over the years in the nuclear industry, but it shows how far back it goes back to when an actual nuclear engineer was president of the United States. That was the Carter administration. As with all energy policies, it makes sense to revisit them. But that, right now, nuclear fuel is stored on site. There's capacity to that for decades. But the industry's been paying for many years for a federal solution, which has not yet materialized. And that's certainly a fair question to ask.
The technology has changed since the 3 Mile Island, which was a success story.
And again, I'm not the last thing I would pretend to be is an expert on nuclear nonproliferation, but that had been the concern with Carter. Well, I remember the Carter administration like it was yesterday. Some of y'all who are younger in the room may not. It was a good little while ago.
We got time for one more question, I believe. Which one of y'all had your hand up first?
I've had it up a couple times, but anyway, Bill Murray, John Timmons, hopefully this is a big fat softball for you. Who are your biggest power consumers today, and then how do you manage the peaks, like Hampton Roads in the summer when it's really hot, and Northern Virginia when it's really cold?
Okay, so biggest power consumers for us still, we have a very balanced load, but still the biggest power consumers collectively are residential customers. Certainly we've got a good industrial base in Virginia. You mentioned Hampton Roads, one of the industrial heartlands, together with the Shenandoah Valley and the Richmond area, I might add. So certainly, notable industrial load, data center load, particularly in Loudoun County and increasingly Prince William County. A big part of our load. We've got a diverse mix of resources, so that's part of how we manage load, energy efficiency, and demand-side management. Delegate Sullivan alluded to transmission, an untold part of the story in managing load. All the generation in the world doesn't do you any good without the right transmission solution. And while maybe not the type of thing that gets talked a lot about energy policy conferences, all of those things have got to work together. We have been working for more than a decade to rebuild, to strengthen and upgrade the transmission network that we've got, particularly in our high traffic areas. So from the smallest distribution line to the largest transmission line, from the smallest rooftop solar facility to the largest nuclear station, every aspect of the system works together because it's just that, it's a system. It's not a collection of disparate resources. Because so many folks in our power generation business nationally have been in the Navy, they tend to call collections or generation portfolios fleets. And just like it wouldn't be a very good fleet if you had just frigates or just destroyers or just cruisers or even just carriers, the key is getting the right balance of resources, and that's what we're trying to do. But Virginia is blessed because we have a very diverse economy, and our load reflects that. We've got a good mix of residential, commercial, and industrial load, and that's something that a lot of our competitor states would be envious to have.
Thank you. We've got several minutes left. Who was the gentleman in the back that had your hand up? We got a couple minutes. You want to go ahead and try yours?
Yeah, I have two cars. One's a hybrid, one's a Suburban. Suburban gets 15 miles per gallon. The hybrid gets 42. So I make a decision. If I'm taking myself to the grocery store, I'm going to drive the hybrid. If I'm going to take 4 kids on a vacation, I'm going to take the Suburban. That makes sense. So all of the above, both of my cars are being used, but one is being used more often. So when you deal with power, you got to deal with how much it costs. So I think people are kind of thinking that the government is making solar really cheap, but it's the technology that's making solar really cheap. So if you can give us the penny difference between solar, wind, nuclear, gas, so that people have an actual idea of what is the difference between those different things there, I think that would be helpful because, clearly one of them is a whole lot more in coal, one is a whole lot more expensive than the other.
Well, Bill's looking it up. A lot of people spend a lot of time doing these numbers. One thing that I'm sure you'll all agree with me is that wind is free, and sunshine is free. Now I understand we're talking about the cost of building things and such and what it ends up costing the consumer. But one of the things that we all have experienced, because we've all seen it on our electric bills, is when the price of a fuel goes up, as it has over the course of the last 6 months for a variety of different reasons. I would suggest to you mostly because of the war in Ukraine. The power generated by that fuel necessarily becomes more expensive. And one of the advantages that solar and wind have over any other power source is that the fuel itself is free. It's just one component of it, I get that. The fuel itself is free. I think Bill's looking this up, but he will tell you that these costs are all dramatically dropped.
So the latest federal, the sort of gold standard that's used in the industry, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA, does an annual report called the levelized cost of new generation. What makes this report a little challenging to use is it came out March 1st, 2022. And as y'all know, there was some geopolitical stuff that happened right as the report was being typed up. And so natural gas prices have gone up dramatically. I'll just give you a couple of illustrative numbers. And what it tries to do, and you can always critique methodology, you can always try to make methodology better. But the reason people like the EIA report, when it says levelized, it's baking in the tax credit, capital costs, fuel costs, tries to get an all-in price.
Try to compare apples to apples.
Where it's wrong, I can just tell you it's flat out wrong, is in looking at natural gas, because natural gas prices at one point it quadrupled from the beginning of the Ukraine war. But so the way it's typically expressed is dollars per megawatt hour. And I'll just give you a few. Ultra supercritical coal, 82.61. I'm going to add this observation. I'm not sure you could permit a coal plant in the United States right now if you were to try to build one. I'm not an environmental lawyer, so I throw that out as a question mark. Combined cycle. So that'd be something like Warren, Brunswick, or Greensville. The time is right around $40, $39.94. It would be higher now. Almost 2/3 of the cost, sometimes of a gas plant, can be the fuel cost. Advanced nuclear, about $88. Offshore wind, I happen to know that number because we, in the litigation, so our levelized cost of energy, $87, right on there with what you look at with nuclear. Biomass, 9017. And I will note, all of these are pre any changes in federal tax policy, which might have occurred this summer. I'm looking off the most recent data we have. Solar standalone, 3649. Solar hybrid, my asset's not good enough to read footnotes C and D. I'm assuming solar hybrid means solar and battery together, which I think is going to become increasingly common. 5253. Hydro, and here again, hydro is a great resource. It doesn't get talked a lot about as a new resource, other than pump storage, which is different. But the hydro, like the Hoover Dam, would be an example of that. Now, we wouldn't have anything that big in the east. Roanoke Rapids would be our biggest hydro facility. 6427, but traditionally very challenging to permit. Combustion turbine, that's a gas peaking unit, which you call CT. Nearest CTs we have, if any of y'all are going to go home on I-95, you can see them right at Ladysmith there in Caroline County. And then battery storage, 12855. They do this report annually because it is commodity dependent. In some cases, it's always solved. So wind and solar are not going to move around. They'll move around because of component costs or construction costs, but not fuel costs. Natural gas, traditionally the most volatile of the numbers. All of them work together, and all of them have a role in the system. So again, I'm going to close where I started. Resist in thinking about energy policy, the one ring to rule them all. Because that makes a very good sort of premise for a fantasy novel. It's not always necessarily the best energy policy.
I want to thank all of you for attending this session today. I thought it was really good, and I appreciate Delegate Sullivan and Mr. Murray for coming up and agreeing to be panelists for this session, and we certainly appreciate all you do. Thank you again. Let's give them a big hand. What do you say?